Hello and welcome to another episode of Nothing Ventured with me, Arish Shah. Today, I am super excited to have with me in the studio Zeynep Koruturk and Kris Naudts. Zeynep and Kris run Firgun Ventures, the first VC firm focused on Series A and B quantum scale-ups, based in London with a global mandate across quantum computing, sensing, and communications. Zeynep built Goldman Sachs' tech initiative in 2015, covered tech at Goldman between 2013 and 2025, met more than 2,000 companies, and left after building a team that managed over $5 billion. She and Kris invested jointly in Cambridge Quantum Computing in 2016, a company that later became Quantinium. Kris trained as a medical doctor with a PhD in computational neuroscience and worked as an academic psychiatrist across King's College and Cambridge before founding multiple award-winning travel company Culture Trip and raising more than $100 million in venture funding. After a decade-long angel track record in quantum, Zeynep and Kris decided to launch Firgun Ventures as they saw seed attention grow while Series A and B leadership remained scarce. In today's episode, we talk about how quantum isn't simply just quantum.
People outside of the ecosystem think about quantum or hear about quantum mostly in the sense of huge funding rounds for quantum computing hardware, which is not indeed, as you just yourself explained, is not the whole thing.
Our venture and nation states are focused on the hardware rather than the software.
Right now, from a venture perspective and from a state perspective, the big chunk of the capital goes to the quantum computing hardware side of things.
And how commercial quantum is coming quicker than some anticipated.
Now, most people would say 3 to 7 years, and it depends what you're talking about. So sensing is more imminent in many ways.
How there isn't an infinite number of quantum physicists out there.
Talent is a major bottleneck. I mean, there isn't just an infinite amount of quantum physicists out there.
Yeah. And why there is a lack of informed capital in this space.
It's very hard for policymakers and countries to devise policies that stop founders from running to the US where they get 3 times the valuation.
Let's get straight into it. Kris, Zeynep, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a real pleasure to have you. I mean, we've been talking, I think, for almost a year now. So really wonderful to have you on the podcast with me. Thank you so much for coming down to the studio.
Thank you for having us.
Amazing. We're going to dive straight in, right? Now, Firgun and obviously you guys invest in quantum, but people talk about quantum almost as a single thing, and that's lumping computing, sensing, and communications together. What are the specific kind of misallocations that you see when capital and founders are treated as interchangeable across those 3 categories? And how does that common framing make it harder to build viable companies? I guess from my perspective, what I'm almost asking is, give us the rundown as to what it means to be in the quantum space. Yeah.
I don't know if you would call it a misallocation or not, but the type of funding that is received across these 3 verticals are quite different. It is fair to say that the big allocation right now goes to quantum computing from a VC perspective and from a state perspective as well. And that's partly because some of the, especially on the quantum networking cryptography side, partly also depends on the developments of the right quantum computing approaches. So we do see that right now, from a venture perspective and from a state perspective, the big chunk of the capital goes to the quantum computing hardware side of things. And that's partly because the hardware has to be developed enough in order to get the software layer on top of it.
Sure.
And therefore, I don't find that a misallocation. I think it is the right approach. But I think if you are going to be investing in the hardware, you have to realize that you have to diversify your bets potentially more than you would in some of these other verticals. So we know roughly that there are about 5 to 6 key architectures in quantum hardware. And the current view is that pretty much all of these different approaches will advance and will actually generate very, very interesting companies within them. And probably these types of companies, like quantum computers, will actually be used for different types of problems, different architectures for different types of problems. And therefore, from an investment perspective, you do want to hedge your bets across some of these key architectures. And that requires a lot of capital. And therefore, in order to play in that field, either you have to be a quantum dedicated VC, where you diversify your bets.
Of which there's very few.
Or there are very, very few. Or you have to be potentially a government entity. It's a bit different on the middleware and the existing software layer, I would say. I think people who want to do few investments tend to not want to go too much on the hardware side, They want to go more on the middleware or software side because they find it more agnostic to the key modalities that might emerge.
So to dig in on that point, right? Because to your earlier point, you can't, software doesn't work without a computer. So in the same way, like building the middleware and the software for quantum doesn't work without the hardware. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem there, right? So,
but not entirely, because for example, look at error correction.
Right.
You will need, these qubits will need to be corrected across most of these modalities. And therefore you can be an error correction player as a middleware. And you actually are fairly agnostic to the parties. I mean, at least in theory, you can be agnostic to the different architectures. And that type of middleware solution is needed for the computers to develop further and to generate more and more qubits that can be used for compute. So yes, you are not entirely wrong. It's true that in certain cases what you say applies. But in other cases, some of these middlewares are essential for the development itself of the hardware, actually.
Got it. Okay. And I guess the question in my head is, certainly in Europe, we have a lot of generalist sort of capital, right? And you guys have specialized in quantum. Do you think founders have to fight against, I guess, a little bit of a lack of understanding of how these various factors within quantum actually come together, how they fit together, whether you should be building the hardware, the software, et cetera, right? To your point, governments, et cetera, maybe prefer the hardware because it takes deep capital, et cetera. And whereas some more generous VCs may look at the software, but is there kind of a blurring of the lines, Kris? Maybe?
I don't think there's much of a blurring. It's helpful and it's confusing. I mean, I think it's confusing in the sense that people outside of the ecosystem think about quantum or hear about quantum mostly in the sense of huge funding rounds for quantum computing hardware, which is not indeed, as you just yourself explained, is not the whole thing. Or they hear about Q-Day, right? I mean, where everything will be decrypted and mayhem will follow. True as that is, up to a point, it misleads a bit or sets up the scene a bit in an awkward way. And then on top of it, sensing is an interesting space. It's probably the least venture of all these spaces because it is more SME-ish almost. And there it gets even more confusing because then a lot of the sensing companies work on medical applications or towards that. So more sensitive sensors for scanners and the like. And then a whole other group works more towards defense and applications in that sphere, which are completely different things, but easier to grasp for people, more appealing to angel investors as well, but probably without the big exits that hopefully can be there in quantum hardware in particular.
And how far away are we from kind of those exits? I mean, like where, like if we think about AI as an example, right?
Yeah.
AI has existed in one form or another for 40, 50, 60 years, right? Like it is not a new concept. What I've always said is it became mainstream because obviously OpenAI released ChatGPT and there was all of a sudden an interface that you could communicate with, and it brought AI into the public domain, albeit that, I've had VCs on this podcast who are building ML and AI apps 30, 40 years ago, as I say, right? So where are we in the life cycle of quantum from your perspective? Because I think it doesn't get talked about a huge amount. And again, maybe because there is a lack of understanding, B, a lack of players in the market. And this is specifically why you guys launched Firgun. But, are we in the initial phases? Are we 10 years away from something critical happening, or is it much further out, or is it much sooner? I mean, give us a sense of kind of where we are on that spectrum.
The story has changed a bit there. Like if you asked the same question 2-3 years ago, people would have said, oh, it's 10, 15 years away.
Right.
Now, most people would say 3 to 7 years. And then it depends what you're talking about. So sensing is more imminent in many ways. And already people are pushing there for actual sellable applications, I would say. In the hardware, very good progress has been made, chiefly due to this field that Zeynep alluded to called error correction, which stabilizes these qubits just much faster due to progress in AI mainly. Stabilize these qubits a lot faster or corrects the errors a lot faster than was the case 2 years ago. And that has led the field to leap forward and roadmaps have collapsed. And then every other half year in the last 2 years probably, the timeline on the decryption also has come down quite a bit. More recently, there were announcements by Google. This is all much nearer than people thought. Probably true. So with a fun term of 10 years, we should be right on the mark here, to be honest with you. I think it's an inflection point, and I think we caught that wave right at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds like that. And I guess you have the confluence of, again, AI, You've got a renaissance within crypto, et cetera, all of which there are, not that they necessarily overlap, but there are applications where you can see that there could well be an interplay.
But I think it's maybe to Chris's point, it's important to add as well that it depends on what you mean. How far are we from
exactly.
How far are we from the exits? How far are we from the results? How far are we from the ultimate quantum computers?
I guess my first question would be, how far are we away from commercial applications of quantum starting to come into the kind of mainstream?
So I think most people think about it as a fairly binary way. So at that year, we will have commercial applications, but we know roughly that some providers, some quantum computer makers are now in the process of being, like, they're on equal par to some of the supercomputers we have.
Interesting.
And therefore, as things evolve, this will exponentially grow. So it's not a binary outcome where there's nothing and then suddenly there are results in quantum computers. We're almost there, and it's going to be gradual.
Yeah.
But then you have that element, and then you have, from a venture capital perspective, you look at the potential exit timelines, because you might have gradual outcomes, but what does that exactly mean? And there it's been a very interesting story, because unlike any other sectors in tech, we've had companies that normally would not be qualified as ready for public markets going public.
Yeah.
Some have been acquired, or some have gone public for very, very large exits. I mean, we have the example, given that we are in the UK, of Oxford Ionics, for example, which was a 3-year-old startup that was acquired for $1 billion by one of the public quantum companies, IonQ. So that was that type of consolidation. And IonQ and a number of other quantum companies had gone public through SPACs a few years ago. Yeah. And some have done well, others less, and we can dive deeper into that as well. But what has happened, especially in the last 6 months, is that there have been quite a few new SPAC announcements, new companies going public. And those companies most likely are going public to try to consolidate, at least within their own verticals, and aim to become one of the quantum majors. And that means that from an investment point of view, you can actually have much quicker exits than you would in a typical fund, partly because of the overall
mergers will speed up that timeline. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So there will be consolidation within the industry. There will be consolidation with big tech that are also looking at quantum. So from that perspective, it's quite interesting.
And with some of the verticals,
and some of the verticals,
like a pharma company could easily buy a drug discovery quantum startup.
So to that extent, which I guess, I mean, and I think again, this comes back to certainly my way of, or my kind of assumption around quantum, right? That it is this one static kind of homogenous thing. It's clearly not. To your point, like if a pharma company can buy an AI company that is specifically looking at, cancer medication, whatever it might be, exactly the same thing could happen with a quantum company. One final question before we move on to the capital kind of question, which I think is super interesting. And again, one of the reasons that you guys built Firgun. But what do you think outside of capital is, and presumably also the technical difficulties, right? But what are the biggest barriers that you guys see to these companies getting traction, whether that is traction in terms of build, whether that's traction in terms of commercial or something else? Is it just capital, or is it, the fragmented nature of the market? Is it the sovereign kind of, we can only play in Europe, or is it something else altogether?
Well, there's a few, right? There's talent. Talent is a major bottleneck. I mean, there isn't just an infinite amount of quantum physicists out there.
Yeah.
Moreover, there isn't an infinite amount or any amount of, say, experienced quantum CMOs out there either, because there aren't that many big enough companies at this point. So that talent is definitely one. Then regulation, of course, which is talking about export bans or licensing. That's only going to become more prominent, I assume. So that would be two, I think, very, very clear impediments. And then incentives for industry to adopt. Is also lacking in many places. Most companies have as customers the defense sector or indeed public bodies.
I mean, so the distribution side of that, which is, I guess, the access as you mentioned, like again, we saw that explode with AI as an example, right? Like one would imagine that at some point quantum may follow a similar sort of pathway, right? If it is showing similar sorts of outcomes. In obviously very different areas, but one would assume that distribution could be solved, because if the problem sets that these businesses are solving, whether on the hardware or the software side, are big enough, which they clearly are, then you will have the hyperscalers, et cetera, interested in.
Yeah, you will have that, but you won't have runaway consumer adoption.
Yes.
Because it's not that
It's
type
not a
of
consumer
product.
tech. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And also, even within these large corporates, I mean, knowing what problems you can solve with quantum and then actually working with different hardware providers and explaining your problem so that the right algorithms are designed on it, it just requires a proper investment from any company to build that internal quantum, like the people who are actually, exactly. So there's a talent piece that also goes into that side of things.
Yeah, so both on the so you need talent to build the hardware and software, but because it is something that is, so advanced in terms of the knowledge of how to build or how to apply, you then need talent. Yeah, exactly. You need quantum literate people as buyers and as distributors, right? Because otherwise you've got you come across that problem, right? So you have to educate the entire ecosystem, right? So coming on to kind of this question around capital, right? Like you've described seed stage quantum funding as getting heavy attention, right? But Series A and B leaders are really scarce. So when should a quantum founder prioritize that kind of small attention-driven style of fundraising and marketing over building the longer term technical milestones that would deter generalist kind of A, B investors? And what do they sacrifice by choosing the attention? I guess the question is, if it's easy to raise seed but harder to raise A or B, like should they therefore play to the earlier stage investors rather than the later stage investors? And that's part of the problem you're trying to solve as well, right? So
yeah, they might not have a choice. I think the challenge that they for them not raising A and B is not necessarily because they're not ready for A and B or that they can't market themselves or they don't have the right milestones. It's generally because there's just not enough capital that is willing to underwrite the type of risk. And at that stage, it's more engineering risk, but it's still there's just not enough capital to underwrite that risk. And I think the problem that we mentioned earlier on people who want to invest in quantum don't have huge budgets at times, like for funds. And if you're a deep tech fund and you want to also have some quantum, you're still going to only have a portion of your portfolio within quantum, and you're going to end up making a small number of investments. And therefore, it's not that this capital does not exist. It's just that it's not a consistent way. Like you don't have certain VCs that you can always go to because they will always be there for A and B. But it's not really something that these companies can do per se. It's more of a structural problem than a problem that is a result of the companies not doing the right things. Yeah.
And I guess the additional question then is like going back to that talent question, right? Are there enough VCs that understand the sector well enough, right, to deploy, right? Like to deploy intelligently. Because again, to your point, if you're a generalist fund, you maybe only have a portion. Even if you are a deep tech hardware, or even have an allocation towards quantum, do you have enough talent within your team to be able to make the right bets at the right time? And then on top of which, if you think about later stage investors, especially in Europe, they tend to be slightly more generalist, right? Like that we know that, we just don't have the deep pools of capital here. And again, this becomes another argument around this whole question of sovereignty and, the kind of national borders of tech regulation. Like, do European governments want their quantum breakout companies going to the US or Southeast Asia or Middle East or wherever it might be, right? Like, I mean, we saw this problem with ARM, right? Like that became a huge national debate and whether that should, whether it should have listed elsewhere or not or whatever. So how do you think about that, right? I mean, does it matter, I guess, as investors, does it matter if they can find the capital, it's fine? Or, do you think that is one of the other barriers to potential kind of scale with these companies?
It's a good question. I mean, it's lack of capital, lack of informed capital, maybe is the better way of putting it.
Informed capital, exactly.
It's a very interesting question because we talked about it as well, or we talk about it or think about it a lot as well. It's very hard for policymakers and countries to devise policies that stop founders from running to the US where they get 3 times the valuation.
Yeah. That's across the board, not just quantum.
But that is just a problem. And in quantum, it becomes interesting because the UK, for example, where we are today, has gotten itself to a very interesting position with having the second highest number of startups in the world after the US. So that's the UK for you. With 65 startups out of 500 or so globally. So a fantastic position. Can it maintain that position? Questionable. These valuations and capital pools.
I think it's also trying to figure out where it wants to sit within.
Correct.
That whole ecosystem. Yeah, sure.
So that would be an observation. And then the observation on Europe is also there in the sense that, of course, they have their EU-wide strategy and policy, but the nation states seem to play for themselves. Some are far ahead, some are far behind.
Well, I mean, France has just awarded 4 cloud contracts to local providers, right? Like, I mean, they are actively trying to move away from dependence on US tech, etc. Right? And I think Europe will continue to go down that path. But to your point, it might not be a EU-wide resolution, maybe country by country, which then complicates even further, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I would say there's an anomaly in this broader situation is that this is not a European or UK problem in quantum.
Interesting.
I mean, we do have top US companies coming to us asking if we can participate in those rounds.
So they can't find the capital. So they're not necessarily finding the capital.
I think the lack of informed investors or larger funds doing this is a global problem. It's more prevalent in Europe because there are other factors, including the valuations, etc. But this is currently also a problem in the US.
That's super interesting because there has been, I think we talked about it outside of this podcast, but there's been an explosion in the number of quantum companies, right? Like I think there were maybe a handful going back 5-10 years. There's now hundreds. And is that evenly spread across kind of the US, Europe, elsewhere? Or are you seeing concentration in some countries? And therefore, I guess, where maybe there are early signals that there is a really strong quantum, I guess, advantage, right? Whether that's, say, the UK or whether that's a region in the US or whether that's somewhere in Southeast Asia, for argument's sake. Typically what I would expect to see is capital and talent then pooling around those regions. Is that what you think is likely to happen? Because if even in the US, you've got founders coming over here, then that suggests that it's still open. Like there's still a very open playing field around kind of who wins from an investment perspective in quantum, right? Unlike, to your point, right? Software companies historically have always only ever been able to really scale and grow and exit in the US to any, certainly to get to larger outcomes. But it sounds like quantum may have to be a much more global play just purely because of the scarcity, both in terms of capital as well as informed capital.
Yeah, I mean, there's nuances here, right? So if you divide the world, so the US is different for many reasons, but one critically different reason compared to other parts of the world is that they have big tech. And big tech has been leading the charge on quantum. Yeah. That's different.
Yeah. And they have the deep enough pockets to acquire, et cetera, et cetera.
And the talent pools and ways in which they can convert other types of talents towards the quantum puzzle, so to speak. So that's the US, and that's critically important to understand, I think, in this wider quantum or global quantum discussion. Then you have China, which has almost like limitless pools of state funding for quantum, which again, nobody can match. And then Europe sits indeed somewhere in the middle with adequate amounts of state funding. And that Europe has got, for sure, excellent academic ecosystems.
100%.
Hence the number of startups being there. And that's the prerequisite for quantum. So if you want to play like a geographical game or geopolitical game, it cannot flourish in a country or in a region where there is no deep academic ecosystem. It cannot. That is the prerequisite for a quantum startup. So the UK actually, yes, it made good decisions. The government made good decisions early, articulated the strategy, but it also has excellent universities from which this could happen. This would have been harder in Paraguay, for example.
Yeah, sure. I actually, one of my strong theses at the moment is that the UK has played at kind of trying to be the next Silicon Valley. I think that's the wrong play. I think where the UK excels is in research, is in university talent. And actually, if we could figure out how to both promote and extract the value from that in a much better way than we have done over the past, I think that's where our edge will come out. And actually, we don't need, a Monday.com. If we can build the next quantum startup or whatever it is that really accrues value to the country, I think then I would rather we double down on that and really took fewer bets on, just random technology and really focus on kind of these areas. Because I think
past the early stages, that would be the way to go. A good example there would be Finland. Finland has a quantum ecosystem that is thriving largely because they have a startup that has been thriving called IQM.
Okay.
And that becomes then a magnet for talent and for the whole ecosystem. So the UK with 64, it should have some good opportunities to pick some good bets and have an ecosystem sprout up around that for the later stages of the quantum journey.
Let's hope. We've shot ourselves in the foot at other times in similar circumstances. But yeah, no, I think again to my earlier point, right? Like when you start seeing those green shoots, talent and capital will hopefully flow towards them. So I think if we can ensure that we maintain the narrative in the right way, then I think we have a really good opportunity to build some really generational companies, especially around quantum. So moving on, still on this question of capital requirements and categorization, right? So at the end of the day, when you're choosing between backing really capital intensive hardware firms with really long illiquid funding horizons versus software and middleware teams that fit faster exit paths, and this goes back to that kind of both liquidity as well as exit opportunity question. What are the predictable kind of portfolio failures that you're prepared to accept? And why do you think it's necessary to, I guess, make those trade-offs? Or is it, for that matter?
I can have an initial go at it. I mean, I think the trade-off you have to accept is the fact that you cannot predict that the founder can scale his or her company.
Always,
but this is critical in this because it's such an important factor. Can that person go beyond asking his or her mates to join his company? Because you will need hundreds of people where they are in short supply, where it's super competitive. So you take a punt on that because you can talk about it till the cows go home. You don't know until you're at it.
Yeah.
So that would be a trade-off I think that we do make. Because what you don't have in quantum is many stupid ideas really. I mean, these people have done 10, 15 years to come even at the point where they could have an idea. So mostly it kind of stacks up from a technical perspective. There's execution, of course, there always will be. But you rarely meet the group of quantum founders you think like, what a waste.
Yeah,
what a silly idea. You rarely have that. So it's then within that, indeed, selecting well for location of ecosystem. And again, there's trade-offs there to be made as well. If you have an excellent quantum team based out of, I don't know, say Norwich, is that a trade-off you're prepared to make?
Yeah.
Because how many people will be prepared to move to Norwich?
On top of that, unlike with software companies, you can't bring in resource from India or the Philippines for argument's sake, right? Like, I mean, you can if it exists.
Oh, no, you wouldn't even be allowed today. You couldn't,
really?
You couldn't just import people from anywhere. No, you couldn't.
Yeah. So, okay. And again, that's probably around the sovereignty and that sort of side of things. So again, that's a massive barrier. And then the second point there is there just isn't enough talent, right? But then on top of that, you've also got so you've got the cross-disciplinary side of it, right? Because presumably, and we're going to talk about this a little bit around your sort of your podcast and the kind of intersections that you look at. But if you are building a quantum business or a quantum startup that touches on healthcare, for argument's sake, you're going to need talent that understands both quantum and health, presumably, right? Yeah. And finding that blend of people that are able to do both is super difficult. I mean, from your perspective, Zeynep, like, and again, because you've been investing at Goldman and then obviously at Firgun now, and therefore presumably you always do have an eye on the exit horizon, etc. Right? Like at the end of the day, a fund is a fund, and it is there to return capital to the LPs. So how do you think about that then? You talked about earlier, we're maybe 3 or 5 years away from kind of the commercialization of some of these technologies. But where are we in terms of those exit timeframes, right? And how does that influence your thinking?
I mean, we're very aware that we're a venture fund and that we have to return capital in 10 years and with upside. So I think when your investment decisions as a VC versus if you were a family office that had a 50-year time horizon would be completely different.
Yeah, sure.
And we are definitely looking at opportunities where we believe there will be new majors. For example, we're just looking at the hardware, for example, we know there are certain areas where there will be like some quantum majors emerging. And then we know roughly within their roadmaps what are the key holes that they may need to fill.
So this is like defense primes in the defense, like there will be some okay,
exactly.
fine.
So there will be key quantum names globally speaking, and we know roughly how they will get to their roadmap, how they will execute on their roadmap. And I think when we look at opportunities, we also definitely assess whether or not the opportunities we're looking at might actually fit into the roadmaps of some of the other
Which
players.
goes back to your point around sort of reverse mergers and SPACs, because that then allows them to also roll
exactly.
up.
So there is that element. Then there's the element of how do they tell the equity story? Because it is not easy, like to have been in a lab in a very different working environment and then turning into a CEO, and God forbid turning into the CEO of a company that has 500 people globally, and actually getting ready for public markets in any other industry. I mean, getting to those stages takes ages.
Yeah.
And in quantum, that has not been the case. I mean, the companies that have gone public, some of them are like less than 10 years old. And I think it does require a very big shift from a leadership perspective to be able to do that. And therefore, from our perspective, it's quite important to be able to equip the founders that we work with to go to the next stages of either larger growth capital rounds with institutional investors, telling the equity story right, or setting up their C-level right to be able to do that, and ideally getting ready for later exits as well, or going to public markets. That's a very, very big focus.
Yeah, that's really similar, I think, to kind of what we see in life sciences as well, right? Where you have quite early stage companies, because they need to raise billions, right? Like in order to take a molecule all the way through to regulatory approval, etc. Right? And so you see them potentially doing listings on secondary markets, or AIM in the UK as an example, potentially in order to access those wider pools of capital.
One interesting difference, I think, in quantum is that there's, and I think that is, again, an anomaly compared to the broader tech, including life sciences, is the amount of non-dilutive public funding sources that are available.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of capital that are going to be given to multiple companies. And these are, I mean, I think one of the most known ones is the DARPA program in the US.
Yeah.
But it is open to international companies. Okay. And therefore, technically, you could have a UK company going there. And depending on what round they're at, they might unlock another 300 million from them.
Wow.
And then they have other countries matching that. So I think one of your earlier question to Kris on what are the key sources that might actually divert a company from becoming successful or not, and that is outside of their control, is also the type of non-dilutive funding sources that will be available to them. And it would not be inconceivable to imagine that the US increases the size of the DARPA program to X number and only allows US companies at some point, which means that all these other companies will not have access to a similar type of sourcing.
Weaponized capital.
And that would change. I mean, it would be outside of the control of these companies, but again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of capital that can be tapped into by international companies at this point in time. And that's very good news for VC investors. And it can be very good news for companies as well, or not, in the sense that depending on the program, we know that, for example, the DARPA program is a very, very thorough program where there are weekly meetings with the companies that receive, I'm talking at the later stages.
Sure.
But that requires a lot of institutional discipline. And I think you can assume that companies that go through that successfully will have a certain level of readiness for the later stages. And if you fail on that, if you go from a very early stage funding to then hundreds of millions, I mean, getting to that mindset of being an institutional party is not a given for any company, I find.
Or for any founder, right?
Or for any founder.
Yeah. I mean, we see it all the time, right? Like the founder at seed A is not necessarily the person who can run a company at B, C,
and they may not
beyond.
want to either sometimes. Right. I mean, it depends on, I think it's really on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. Again, these are very smart people. No doubt they can learn what needs to be done. They might not want to do that.
They may not enjoy it. Yeah, for sure.
A lot of them are what you can call accidental founders.
Yeah.
The reason that they founded the company was that they couldn't grow it anymore in the lab, what they tried to build.
Interesting. Yeah. And also, I mean, like if you spent your life really trying to solve, a problem and a problem that is as big as quantum obviously is, to go from that to like managing 500 people is like, it's a completely different, it's not even just about different skill set. I wouldn't be interested in doing that, for example, right? Like that will, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but these are important considerations for founders as well, I think.
Well, and on top of that, to your point around the kind of non-dilutive capital, I mean, that's obviously massively positive on the one hand. On the other hand, one would imagine that DARPA, as an example, then becomes potentially an exit route, right? Like, I mean, or governments become an exit route, or, you know, in the same way that defense primes become, you know, potentially exit routes. But there are various signals that come out of taking that type of capital, right? Like, and there are considerations about use cases and so on and so forth. You get into the kind of debates that people have had, around various defense companies out of the US and their interaction with governments, et cetera, right? So I guess the thing that always needs to be weighed up is, yes, the need for capital, but also in what direction does that capital take you, right? Because not all capital is created equal. Yeah.
No, definitely.
100%. Kris, I wanted to talk about your podcast, right? Which explores intersections. So that could be quantum and health, it could be quantum and art or finance. So, you know, despite the fact that quantum needs to solve the hardware problem before it can solve the vertical problem, what are the use cases that you're most keen to explore, both in the fund and on the pod? And what is the area that most people just don't even have on their radar at the moment?
I think people have a few of these things on their radar, in all fairness, as you yourself indicate. I mean, it's nothing compared to AI, what you see in terms of content when it comes to quantum. Although there is much more than you think. Now that you're also fully sensitive to it, you will see it.
I'm going to start seeing it. Yeah, for sure.
Like
the algorithm's going to be...
but even the FT pushes out a lot of content on quantum, and now that you have your eyes open for it, you will see that. But no, personally, as a doctor, obviously, I'm interested in the whole drug discovery part and in the diagnosis. And the news there is positive, right? I mean, there are a few places that are really pioneering. So one of the factors of luck in Europe is that Novo Nordisk, the Ozempic drug maker, has put itself squarely behind quantum and wants to be a leader in quantum, and has propelled the ecosystem in Denmark forward like nothing else. And then there are some pharma companies as well on top of that, like Boehringer Ingelheim, that is quite active. Eli Lilly is quite active in that whole quantum and drug discovery area. And then in terms of hospitals, the real pioneer is the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, who had the vision to put a quantum computer in their canteen already like a few years ago.
Okay. So, I mean, not what you'd expect from Cleveland.
No. Well, Cleveland or the Cleveland Clinic is one of the top hospitals in the world. I mean, they were particularly famous for cardiac surgery, etc. Okay. So you have the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic. So if you're a doctor, these are top.
I mean, I know the Mayo. I'd never heard the Cleveland.
No. It's top. Okay. And you might not think about it that way.
My apologies to the Cleveland Clinic.
Yeah, no, they will call you. But the fact that they did that, to put that quantum computer there, set up partnerships with IBM and the likes, with Google, you name it. I mean, that is very exciting to see. NVIDIA has been a bit of an interesting story as well, from a CEO who expressed skepticism only to then row back and express the opposite, only to a few weeks ago go very big on quantum actually, and propelled the valuation of many of the public companies, quantum companies forward actually, with their initiatives in AI, particularly to aid quantum.
Yeah.
But yes, very excited about the whole pharma and diagnosis field, I would say, very much so. Intrigued by finance, because finance is kind of pushing the envelope a bit for marginal gains, and out of security reasons, of course, as well. Telco is doing much the same. But yeah, my excitement lies in pharma. I find space very interesting, but that's personal. And it's the beauty of quantum. It does, at full capacity, it will touch every single sector, and it starts to already. To your point on use cases, I find it interesting how people confuse use cases and business cases. Not the same.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, use cases galore, but business cases a bit less. As in, will it aid many businesses to their bottom line? Probably not today.
Yeah.
But the use cases are there.
Yeah. I mean, like, if finance is a great example, right? Like, you already have hedge funds trying to find, the edge, and, like micro trading at infinitesimally sort of small levels. And now, if you add quantum into the mix, that could propel further, right? But then the question is, does that capture one? Does that capture hundreds, right, of potential clients? And, you'd imagine that you may have, a large, bank or institution or whoever it might be, capture, the best performing quantum finance kind of business out there. I guess, and so, on your podcast, like, what are you, what are you intending to do that? Is that just exploring how quantum touches on these areas, or is it exploring some of the use cases, or exactly what is the...
Well, the rationale at first was that if you speak to people about quantum, they ask, well, how does it work? Like as if it's going to be a 30-second conversation. You're going to know. It's a bit,
give me the idiot's guide to quantum.
Yeah, exactly. Hard to do, truly hard to do. So we tended and we started to tackle those questions more by going in these intersections because it speaks more to people.
Yeah, because they can visualize how it might be
exactly.
used.
Talk about how quantum helps AI, how AI helps quantum. I mean, people just are coming far more on board with the whole narrative and the story. So that was the rationale. And we set out to do 6 episodes, not more than that, just to get that out and then see how we found making it, whether there was appetite for more. So that's a bit where we are now. We're doing the final recording tomorrow on quantum and finance, actually.
How did you find making it?
Hard. Hard in the sense that as a psychiatrist, I'm used to talking to people. But this is a very different kind of talking. And in quantum, because it's such a technical field, you're bringing then on top of it 2 fields together.
Yeah, that's tough.
So you need to be well prepared and to make a conversation flow. Like I talk much less than you do as a host. Which no. I now realize maybe I should talk a bit more.
No, not at all. But I get 50-50. I get feedback from some people saying you talk too much, and I get feedback from others saying you talk just enough. But I would typically say I probably talk more than I should. But anyway,
I don't know. It gets a richer dialogue, perhaps. Otherwise, it is a bit more Q&A. But every episode would require probably about a day's prep though, of me.
Well, but that's understandable, right? Because again, the technical complexity, right? Like, and I've had these, when I talk to founders, who are deep within the technical realms of, say, AI or even biotech or whatever, right? Like, I'm not an expert in any of those fields. I know enough to be dangerous, as they would say, right? But not in a good way. But it is really difficult because you have to understand enough about the topic to be able to have that conversation. But you're also learning from the individual, right? Because ultimately they are the expert, right? No, I can imagine. I'm not entirely sure I could do a deeply technical podcast or conversation of that nature. I mean, I think. I mean, hats off to you. I mean, and someone who's been doing this for sort of 4 or 5 years, I know how difficult it is just to do a podcast. To do a podcast in an area where you obviously have huge interests, clearly, right, but are not technically from that background. I can imagine that's challenging, but also fulfilling at the same time.
Yeah, and we had great guests, and they make it after all. Right?
Send some of them my way as well. I'd love to shut up for an hour and just understand what they're doing. So this has been a really amazing conversation. I'd love to end the podcast on a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests. Maybe you could take them individually. So firstly, what is one thing that you have a contrarian conviction about from any area of life, whether that's work, politics, socially, or at home? You're laughing, so I'm going to go.
No, I think Kris will have more contrarian views than I do. So I was going to go for you. Huh?
Well, you're investing in quantum. I think that's slightly contrarian enough, but no, please. And by the way, we found, having now done this for the last year and a half, this particular question, it's a lot harder than most people think to have a contrarian opinion, right?
It's more because I think if I naturally had a few contrarian opinion that came to mind, I would say it, but now I would have to come up with a contrarian opinion. Is the way I think about it. I mean, I don't have one that immediately comes up to my mind.
I don't know if it's contrarian, but I find it like one thing I feel that we cannot do in quantum, and that applies to any sector, yet every sector is exactly doing that, which is looking away from China.
Yes.
And that is just not, you can't do that. You cannot do that. And it's complacency. And we ask it from everybody and you get the same complacent answer at best. Well, so normally the answer goes something like, yeah, very hard to know what they're up to, right? Okay. Second go, yeah, but they do publish in the main journals.
Yeah,
to an extent. And then there's nobody and nothing that goes underneath. Not in defense today, much at all. Not in quantum, not in AI. It's very, very, very superficial.
This is one of, I'm really glad you said that. This is one of the massive issues I've had here in the West over the last decade that I've been working in venture. Right, like this trope that China can't innovate, it can only copy. I mean, I've worked in Southeast Asia, I've worked in Papua New Guinea, and then been to China. And that's just the most stupid thing.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's quite that anymore. I think they do realize that the talent there and the capabilities are there.
Yeah,
I think they just don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, exactly. But
it's more that, as in they realize that it's a challenge.
It's realizing you're an alcoholic, you need to then solve it.
Yeah, because you're right. A few years ago, that was the case. They thought it would be copycat things. And now I think people realize that there's immense amount of talent and capability there
are
and funding.
30 EVs on the market, right? And we certainly have like Tesla, Volkswagen, like they've literally created like whatever, however many 30 brands of electric vehicles. I think you're right. And it's a message. I mean, I actually was talking about it earlier on my news podcast. I think the West needs to get out of this mindset that China's just behind the scenes.
Yeah, let's forget about that.
Yeah. Let's not worry about it. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really dangerous, and not in a negative way that it's dangerous, right? Like it's dangerous to just assume that they aren't doing stuff, because, you could well get to a point where they are outpacing us on across several realms and domains, right?
In quantum, it would be dangerous.
Exactly. And well, 100%, right? Quantum and AI, actually, in both cases, right? And again, going back to kind of the earlier points that we were talking about, the sovereignty and the national kind of drive to capture more of these companies and keep them local. Yeah, you are in a race against multiple different regions in the world, and it would be absolutely remiss for anyone to sort of think that China is not right at the forefront. I mean, it is the US, then China, then the UK in terms of venture, and the UK is dwarfed by China. But that's not to say that we can't do it. We do have great researchers. We do have, incredible talent, incredible connections, globally. And that is one of the strengths. So finally, so that we can get to know the real you, what is something that moves you the most emotionally?
A lot of things move me. I'm originally Turkish.
Yeah.
So we do get moved by a lot of things.
Excellent.
I think there's of course a lot of worry about what quantum may bring or may not bring, etc. But to be honest, when I think about the potential implications of some of these technologies, whether it's for climate change, whether it's for new drug discovery, etc., it does give me a lot of joy to be working in this space when you think of the next generations that might actually live in a better world, hopefully, if we can manage some of the potential downsides that come with it. But that's the fact that that's part of my day-to-day role is quite an exceptional thing for me.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I mean, I've been thinking about this sort of stuff a lot actually recently because a lot of my family are getting older, and that's the nature of life. But this whole kind of thing that we've managed to extend quantity of life, but not quality of life, right? Like, and what I would hope is that some of these technologies and hopefully some of these technologies working together will be able to improve that so that, we can both extend quantity as well as quality of life. And you're right, like to be at the forefront of seeing the companies that are actually just kind of moving in that direction or trying to make that dent in the world. I think, I can understand.
To the extent that we can, if we can also be a bit more intentional about how some of these companies might work around such things, is a very nice place to be in.
Yeah, 100%. How about you, Kris?
Yeah, for me, what moves me a lot is being in tech is San Francisco with that sort of extreme contradiction between, on the one hand, the extreme wealth that the tech crowd has and creates and that we partly contribute to. And then as a psychiatrist, these masses of homeless people who suffer from mental illness, which is ultimately ever so addressable, it shouldn't be like this. And it upsets me and it infuriates me in equal measure when I'm there, even if I love San Francisco.
But you're bringing a European mindset to an American problem.
And bring a psychiatrist mindset to it and a human's mindset where I feel that they've lost that a bit. I don't know, with that idea that everybody's responsible for their own situation, not quite.
Yeah.
We don't all have the same cards.
Yeah, no, look, I could talk about that. I'm from Kenya originally, and you see that day to day when you're out there. I was out there in February, but Kenya has the excuse, quote unquote, of having been a developing country for a number of years. The US, of course, a bit more developed, right? So you would hope that they would have crossed that river by now. But yeah, look, I really do understand that contradiction and that juxtaposition, and it almost feels Dickensian, right? It almost feels like you're living in the Artful Dodgers kind of timeline where you have massive wealth and then massive poverty and seemingly no answer to both of those when there's an obvious answer, right? And there really are obvious answers to that. what I have heard from those that know San Francisco better than I do is that it's improved compared to maybe 5-6 years ago. But
from a very low.
From a low.
Since COVID,
probably,
it has improved.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Okay, I take your point. Not great. But yeah, no. Look, I mean, I think it is one of these things. I mean, like the reason I got into the venture ecosystem was by happenstance, but why I remained in it is because I saw just the potential of what could be done and how people's life. And I would say today, I'm far happier than I've ever been in venture because we've gone from funding, as I say, relatively kind of nice to have software startups. They all played a role, and I'm not going to sit here and say that they're all they're all worthless. But it feels like venture has gone back to, if you think about the traitorous eight and semiconductors, like we're now, it feels like venture has started investing again in actually really important technology that is transformational at the state level, at the national level, but also at the human level, right? And I think that's incredibly important, and maybe that will help solve the problem in San Francisco and elsewhere as well. Kris, Zeynep, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on the podcast. For the audience, where can they find you online? You're on LinkedIn, on Twitter, X, sorry. Where's the best place for them to find you on the internet? Yeah, LinkedIn and the website, Firgun.vc, and our LinkedIn profiles. Yeah, amazing. Well, we'll be adding those to the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you having come out here and really enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again for having us. Thank you. It was a pleasure.